Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time when winters were long, houses were drafty, and insulation meant stuffing hay into your socks. So dim your lights, settle in under the blanket, and let's wander together through the frosty lanes of the medieval countryside. Because while kings and queens were busy commissioning tapestries and occasionally marrying their cousins, most people were just trying not to freeze to death before Lent. And naturally, they made it more complicated than it needed to be. Let's begin with the average peasant home. Imagine a small wooden hut, one room, maybe two, if you were extremely lucky or had bribed your landlord with enough chickens. The walls were thin. The floor was dirt, not polished oak. Windows? Yes, technically, except window usually meant a hole covered by cloth, wood, or, if you were feeling particularly luxurious, a thin sheet of animal bladder. Yes, pig bladder. You looked out at the snow through something once attached to a squealing hog. That's the level of glamour we're dealing with. Now, to stay warm, the family relied on the hearth, a fire right in the center of the room, filling the hut with heat, smoke, and the distinct fragrance of wet socks. There was usually no chimney. Smoke simply drifted upward, clinging to the rafters like a permanent indoor fog. You inhaled it constantly. Your lungs may have resembled overcooked sausages by the age of 30, but at least you weren't freezing. Sleeping arrangements were equally charming. Families often piled together on a single straw mattress. Parents, children, sometimes even a wandering uncle who forgot to go home. You would all lie side by side, fully dressed, because removing clothing was a luxury reserved for royalty or people with actual heating. The straw mattress, by the way, was called a palliasse. It was filled with reeds or straw, and after about 2 weeks of use, it smelled like the inside of a barn, which made sense, because it essentially was. To improve warmth, peasants would tuck animals inside, chickens under the bed, dogs by the feet, and in poorer households, sometimes even a small cow or goat indoors. The goat was not particularly comfortable, but it did generate heat, and in medieval life, you couldn't be picky about your bedfellows. If you ever wondered where the phrase three dog night came from, that's the idea. Though in medieval Europe, it might be one cow, two chickens, and a cousin you didn't like. Clothing doubled as blankets. Wool tunics, cloaks, and rough linens were layered endlessly. Mittens were often just pieces of cloth sewn together. Footwear was rudimentary. Leather shoes, sometimes lined with straw. On especially frigid nights, people stuffed moss or hay inside to act as insulation. It wasn't elegant, but it kept your toes attached. And of course, the body adapted. Winters meant eating heavier foods when possible. Lots of bread, root vegetables, and if you were lucky, some salted pork. Alcohol helped too. Ale, which everyone drank, children included, was consumed steadily. It wasn't strong, but it gave the illusion of warmth. Nothing like a bit of lukewarm, mildly sour beer to make you forget that frostbite is setting in. The wealthier classes fared better, though not by as much as you'd think. Stone castles were drafty. Fireplaces were huge. but so were the rooms. Heat escaped instantly. And those grand tapestries? They weren't just decorative, they were insulation, trying desperately to keep the walls from dripping with condensation. Kings might have had velvet robes, but they still slept under multiple layers of fur, often with servants nearby just to keep the fire going. It wasn't cozy so much as slightly less miserable. Now, let's drift back to the peasants. Beyond the practical measures, they also turned to folklore. Cold was not just weather, it was spiritual. Harsh winters were believed to come from divine punishment or supernatural interference. The wild hunt, a ghostly procession of spirits in the sky, was said to sweep through during winter nights, snatching away souls who wandered too far from the hearth, which frankly was a poetic way of saying, don't go outside, you'll freeze. Superstition also shaped their survival tactics. Certain herbs were burned for warmth, not because they gave off more heat. They didn't, but because smoke was thought to drive away evil winter spirits. This made the house smell vaguely medicinal, as though you were living in a mixture of cabbage soup and witch's ointment. Still, belief mattered. If you thought your smelly herb bundle kept the demons away, you probably slept a little easier. We can also drift into the curious world of medieval sleeping patterns. Unlike our modern 8-hour block, people often slept in 2 shifts. First sleep lasted from sundown until midnight or so. Then people woke up, stoked the fire, maybe prayed, maybe whispered gossip, maybe even snuck over to a neighbor's bed. Then came second sleep, stretching until dawn. This segmented sleep made the long nights more manageable. It also gave everyone time to reflect on dreams, which were often taken quite seriously as divine messages or warnings about your neighbor's cabbage patch. Naturally, the nobility managed to turn sleeping into an even stranger ordeal. Beds were enormous, 4-posted, and piled high with furs. But comfort was relative. Mattresses were stuffed with feathers. Yes, but the feathers poked, and the bedbugs thrived. Curtains were drawn around the bed to keep out drafts, but they also trapped in smells. And if you were the king, you did not sleep alone. Courtiers sometimes stayed in the same room, ready to fetch water or take notes if you mumbled something prophetic in your dreams. Privacy was not really a medieval concept, but let's not drift too far into royal chambers just yet. Tonight, our focus is still on the common folk, the people who faced winter every year with little more than wool, superstition, and a good amount of stubbornness. And here's where it gets oddly admirable. Despite the conditions, the cold huts, the smoky air, the drafty windows of pig bladder, medieval peasants endured. They found small comforts, a shared fire, a family huddled together, a dog curled at their feet, and yes, sometimes, the faint buzz of too much ale. Life was hard. Nights were long, but the human capacity for survival has always been remarkable. So as you drift deeper into rest tonight, imagine yourself in one of those huts. The fire crackles faintly. The air is smoky. Outside, snow is falling across empty fields. You're lying on straw, covered by rough wool, a chicken rustling nearby. It's not glamorous, but in its own way, it's simple. A reminder that even in the bleakest winters, people found ways to endure and even to laugh. Because, really, if you can survive January with a goat in your bedroom, you can survive almost anything. And with that image, let's gently drift over to our next subject, the royals, of course. Because if peasants suffered through smoke-filled huts, you can bet their kings and queens found even stranger, often sillier ways of dealing with winter's bite. So now that we've tucked the peasants in for the night, snug beneath their straw, a chicken at their feet, let's tiptoe quietly into the castles of the wealthy. Because surely, you're thinking, kings and queens didn't suffer from the cold. They had servants, they had velvet, they had banquets and furs. Surely they lived in comfort. Well, not quite. Castles were impressive fortresses, tall stone walls, towers bristling with archers, moats filled with something suspiciously green. All very good for keeping out enemies. Not so good at keeping out the weather. Stone, after all, is not known for its cozy warmth. In winter, castle walls sweated cold, like giant slabs of ice. Imagine living inside a refrigerator, except the refrigerator is also full of drafty corridors and armed men who haven't bathed since Pentecost. And yes, there were fireplaces, huge ones. They looked wonderful in paintings. A massive stone hearth, flames leaping, a nobleman sitting nearby with his goblet of wine. But the heat rarely traveled more than a few feet. The person closest to the fire was sweating, the one across the room was shivering, and the poor servant by the door was frozen solid, probably reconsidering all his life choices. Tapestries helped. Nobles lined their walls with them, and not just to look cultured. Thick woven cloth provided insulation, keeping the worst drafts out, at least in theory. In practice, the walls still oozed dampness, and the tapestries occasionally became homes for moths. So while you admired your grand depiction of the Trojan War, a small army of larvae was quietly munching away at the edges. And then, of course, there were furs. Kings and queens swaddled themselves in ermine, mink, fox, and bear. The more exotic, the better. Nothing said, I'm rich and vaguely ridiculous, like walking around draped in snow leopard. Did it keep them warm? Somewhat. Did it also smell faintly like wet dog whenever it rained? Absolutely. Beds were the true fortress against winter. The nobility invented elaborate contraptions, four-poster beds with heavy curtains that could be drawn tight, essentially creating a fabric cocoon. Inside, they layered wool blankets, feather mattresses, and piles of furs. A royal bed could contain enough animal products to populate a small zoo. But even then, mornings were brutal. Getting out of bed meant stepping onto an icy stone floor. Unless, of course, you had a servant who came in early to warm your slippers by the fire, which is exactly why one became king in the first place. Of course, not everything about royal winters was dignified. Take, for instance, the warming pan. Essentially, a metal pan filled with hot coals, slid under the bed covers before sleeping. It was ingenious in theory. In practice, it sometimes scorched the sheets. On unfortunate occasions, it even set them on fire. Nothing says restful slumber quite like waking up to your mattress smoldering beneath you. Royal children had their own peculiar hardships. Imagine being 5 years old, wearing 6 layers of brocade, and still being told you needed to sit quietly through a 4-hour banquet in a freezing hall. Princes and princesses were dressed up like decorative dolls, expected to look regal even while their noses turned blue. And since children were seen as miniature adults, no one thought to let them run around to keep warm. Instead, they sat, they endured, and they sneezed extravagantly onto imported silk. Now, heating wasn't just about comfort, it was about status. Nobles used fire as a symbol of wealth. More fires burning meant more prestige. In some castles, entire forests were cut down just to keep the hearths glowing through winter. Of course, this made the halls warm for the lords while the peasants outside shivered, staring at the treeless hills they once used for firewood. As always, hierarchy expressed itself most clearly through who got to be slightly less cold. And then there were the unintended consequences. All those fires meant smoke. Chimneys were still relatively new in the Middle Ages, and not always well designed. Smoke poured back into the rooms, coating the walls with soot. Servants had to scrub constantly. Nobles, meanwhile, walked around in glittering clothes that carried a faint aroma of burnt oak. So yes, your medieval king might have looked resplendent in his fur-trimmed robes. He also smelled like a campfire that never ended. The royal obsession with staying warm extended into travel as well. When kings moved between castles in winter, they traveled with enormous entourages, bringing carts loaded with blankets, furs, and bed curtains. Some monarchs even had portable stoves carried with them. Imagine being the servant assigned to haul a smoldering metal box across icy roads just so your lord wouldn't have to endure a chilly chamber upon arrival. That was someone's entire career. Now, not all royals were equally stoic about the cold. Some were notorious complainers. Charles V of France was said to have disliked drafts so intensely that he avoided large halls entirely, preferring smaller, warmer rooms. Others developed curious habits. Queen Elizabeth I of England famously adored her fur-lined gowns, though courtiers noted they often carried fleas, which, one imagines, was not the regal impression she intended. Speaking of fleas, let's remember that warmth often brought pests. Beds piled high with furs and feathers were essentially playgrounds for lice and vermin. The more luxurious the bedding, the more likely it was alive in ways you'd rather not discuss before bedtime, which meant royals, for all their wealth, scratched just as much as peasants. They simply scratched in embroidered gloves. Of course, while royals wrapped themselves in furs, peasants were expected to provide the fuel. Entire communities labored to chop wood, gather peat, and transport supplies to castles. Some lords even enforced strict rules. Peasants were forbidden to cut firewood from certain forests, because those trees were reserved for the lord's fireplaces. So while peasants huddled around smoky hearths, their labor was keeping the king's great hall faintly less unbearable. Let's not forget the ceremonial aspect of heat. Fires weren't just practical, they were staged. When hosting guests, a noble might have multiple hearths blazing, even if the warmth was uneven, to give the impression of abundance. Picture it, a banquet hall lined with roaring fires, guests shivering anyway, because the warmth dissipated instantly into the cavernous space. It was less about comfort and more about showing off how many logs you could afford to burn. Interestingly, some castles experimented with early forms of central heating, hypocaust systems, borrowed from ancient Rome, involved channels beneath the floor that carried hot air from furnaces. A few very wealthy nobles attempted versions of this, though most were crude and inefficient. Still, it shows that even in the damp chill of medieval Europe, someone was always trying to invent the medieval equivalent of underfloor heating. But the irony remains. The higher you climbed socially, the less practical your living conditions often became. Peasants, with their smoky huts and close-knit families, were at least physically near their only source of heat. Nobles, surrounded by wealth and servants, lived in drafty stone palaces that resisted every attempt at warmth. Luxury, it seems, was a colder business. So, as you drift off tonight, imagine yourself in one of those great halls. A fire roars in the hearth, but the air around you is still icy. Your velvet robe is heavy, your fur cloak tickles your neck, and a servant is quietly poking at a pile of coals to keep the illusion alive. Outside, the snow falls silently. Inside, you wonder if the goat in the peasant's hut might actually be warmer company. And with that cozy thought, let's wander gently toward our next story, because winter wasn't just endured. It shaped royal politics, marriages, and even the questionable decisions of entire dynasties. Hey everyone, let's drift a little further tonight. We've spent some time with peasants and royals, shivering in their huts and castles. But now, let's let the fire burn low and wander into something a little stranger. What if the ruins we know, the pyramids, Stonehenge, Machu Picchu, were not the oldest? What if, buried deep under layers of earth and ice, there were traces of civilizations far older than us? Civilizations that existed before humans, before what we call history even began. It's the kind of idea that makes archaeologists groan and conspiracy theorists cheer. But it's worth letting the thought sit quietly for a moment. After all, human history itself has been rewritten many times. Not long ago, most scholars insisted complex society began around 5,000 years ago. Then we found Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a site 12,000 years old, with intricate stone pillars, carvings, and a temple-like layout. It pushed the timeline back. Suddenly, the primitive hunter-gatherers weren't so primitive after all. Indeed, if that could happen once, why not again? Of course, no serious evidence points to pre-human civilizations, not in the way science fiction imagines them. But that doesn't stop the mind from wandering. Imagine a people, not quite like us, maybe taller, maybe smaller, maybe nothing we'd recognize as human at all. They lived through an age we've forgotten, building structures that time has swallowed, creating myths that no one remembers, leaving behind only fragments buried under oceans or deserts. Naturally, our own world gives us clues that fuel this speculation. Consider the ocean floor. More than 80% of it remains unmapped. We know less about the deep sea than we do about the surface of Mars. Which means if a city were once swallowed by rising seas, and seas have risen dramatically since the last ice age, we wouldn't necessarily know it. Whole coastlines have disappeared. What might be hiding under the waves? Or take Antarctica. Beneath its ice lie mountain ranges, valleys, even lakes, all sealed away under miles of frozen history. If a civilization ever flourished there, tens of thousands of years ago, we would not know. The ice erases all, but still, the thought lingers, and late at night, it becomes oddly comforting to imagine that the world is older, stranger, and richer than we've been told. And then there are the oddities that keep this speculation alive. Out of place artifacts. They're sometimes called a Roman style coin found in a layer of earth supposedly older than Rome, a stone hammer encased in rock that seems millions of years old. Most of these finds are explained away, misidentified layers, geological quirks, or simple mistakes, but a few remain tantalizing, like little whispers from a past we can't quite access. If we did find proof, undeniable proof, of a civilization predating humanity, what would it mean? For one thing, history books would need some very quick and very nervous rewriting. Every tidy timeline, every chart of Stone Age to Bronze Age to Iron Age would unravel. Human exceptionalism, that smug idea that we are the first and only intelligent species, would crack. We'd have to ask uncomfortable questions. Did they vanish because of natural disaster? Did they destroy themselves? Or did they simply fade, leaving us to stumble forward in their absence? And of course, humans being humans, we'd argue about it endlessly. Scholars would insist on peer-reviewed evidence. Conspiracy theorists would say, "I told you so." Governments might try to control the discovery, fearing panic. Meanwhile, the rest of us would sit at home, sipping tea, trying to fall asleep, and wondering whether we're living on top of someone else's forgotten ruins. There's also something humbling in the idea. We tend to see ourselves as the pinnacle of progress, the cleverest, the most advanced. But history teaches us otherwise. Every civilization believes it will last forever. None do. Rome crumbled. The Maya cities fell silent. The great empires of Mesopotamia dissolved into dust. Why should we imagine we're immune? So perhaps, if there were civilizations before us, their ruins are less a mystery and more a warning, a quiet message under stone and ice. We were here. We thought we were permanent too. Of course, bedtime is not the hour for existential dread. It's for gentle speculation. So instead, let's picture these pre-human civilizations as dreamlike, almost whimsical. Imagine libraries carved into mountainsides, now overgrown with moss, or delicate glass-like structures, shattered by earthquakes, their fragments glinting deep in the ocean. Imagine myths we never inherited, gods with names we'll never know, stories about stars long since burned out. Maybe they left no machines, no skyscrapers, nothing loud or obvious. Maybe their legacy is subtle, patterns in the earth, designs in stone, whispers in the collective imagination. Sometimes our oldest myths feel like memories too ancient to be ours. Floods, great fires, battles between sky and sea. Could those be cultural fossils, handed down in some strange way from a time before? Probably not. But isn't it oddly comforting to wonder? So tonight, as you sink deeper under your blanket, think of the ground beneath you. Layers of earth, thousands of years deep. Beneath them, older layers still. each one hiding stories we'll never fully know. And maybe, just maybe, far below, there's a fragment of a world that came before us, a world that lived, loved, suffered, and vanished, leaving only silence. And in that silence, we dreamed NOW. Let's drift onward. Because if forgotten civilizations stretch behind us, there are also secrets hidden closer to the surface, in the castles, cathedrals, and quiet corners of the medieval world. And some of those secrets were decidedly strange. Hey everyone, let's get comfortable, close our eyes, and wander into something softer than cold castles and smoky halls. Tonight we're drifting into dreams, not our own, but the dreams of people who lived thousands of years ago, the way they imagined them, the way they explained them, and the curious importance they gave to the strange theater of the sleeping mind. Because while we tend to treat dreams as random nonsense, the brain making up stories while we rest, ancient civilizations often took them very seriously. Dreams could be warnings. They could be messages from the gods. They could be political tools. And naturally, they could be badly misinterpreted with consequences that were usually embarrassing for everyone involved. Mesopotamia. Dreams as divine text messages. Let's begin in Mesopotamia, that bustling cradle of civilization between the Tigris and Euphrates. The people there didn't just dream, they cataloged dreams. Entire clay tablets survive with long lists of dream scenarios and their meanings, like the world's oldest dream dictionary. If you dreamed of eating figs, for example, it was good luck. If you dreamed of water, it could mean joy or disaster, depending on how murky the water was, which is a polite way of saying it could mean anything. So good luck figuring it out. Kings were especially obsessed with dreams. They believed the gods used them as messengers. Before important battles, rulers often prayed for guiding visions. If a dream seemed favorable, they marched with confidence. If not, they might delay or even cancel their plans entirely. One wonders how many wars were rescheduled because someone dreamed of, say, a slightly crooked tree. Naturally, kings didn't interpret dreams themselves. That was the job of professional interpreters, the ancient equivalent of sleep therapists, except with more incense and fewer qualifications. Egypt, dreams as portals. The Egyptians, meanwhile, thought of dreams as direct doors to the divine. To dream was to step briefly into another world, one where gods, spirits, and the dead could appear. This gave dreams immense authority. If you saw your late uncle in a dream telling you to invest in more goats, well, you probably invested in more goats. They also compiled dream books, written in hieratic script on papyrus. These texts offered guidance. If you dreamt of drinking warm beer, it meant good things. If you dreamt of losing your teeth, it was a bad omen. So yes, even 3,000 years ago, people were waking up worried about their teeth falling out in dreams. Some anxieties, it seems, are timeless. Greece and Rome. Dreams with homework. The Greeks gave dreams a more philosophical spin. Thinkers like Aristotle shrugged and said, well, dreams are probably just the brain processing leftovers of the day, which, admittedly, is fairly modern sounding. But others leaned hard into symbolism. Artemidorus, a Greek writer in the 2nd century, produced a 5-volume dream interpretation manual. He categorized dreams with all the precision of a librarian who had far too much time. Dreams about flying? Possibly good, possibly bad, depending on altitude. Dreams about sex? Almost always metaphorical, which must have been comforting for anyone having awkward nocturnal thoughts about their neighbor's spouse. The Romans inherited much of this, though they tended to use dreams politically. A well-timed dream could justify almost anything. If an emperor wanted to invade somewhere, all he needed was a conveniently prophetic dream to announce, "Jupiter told me so." Of course, no one could argue with that. It was the ancient version of saying, "Because God said I could," except with more marble statues involved biblical and religious dreams. Dreams also slip quietly through the Bible, the Quran, and countless other religious texts. Joseph famously interpreted Pharaoh's dream of 7 fat cows followed by 7 thin ones as a prophecy of famine. This not only saved Egypt, but also set the bar dangerously high for future dream interpreters. After all, it's hard to look impressive when your neighbor dreams of a goat and you're forced to shrug. In medieval Europe, Christian thought sometimes dismissed dreams as meaningless, or worse, as temptations from the devil. But even then, kings still consulted monks about them, because it's one thing to dismiss dreams when you're a peasant, quite another when you're deciding whether to go to war.th, you ordinary sleeper. But let's step away from kings and priests for a moment. What about the ordinary dreamer, the farmer, the merchant, the fisherman? For them, dreams were less lofty prophecy and more daily guidance that dreamed of losing money. Better keep a tighter hand on your purse at market. Dreamed of rain? Maybe the harvest would be good. Dreamed of death? Time to make an extra offering, just in case. Dreams also offered comfort. Seeing dead relatives in sleep was not frightening. It was reassuring. It meant they were still present, still watching. A sort of ancient version of the late-night phone call, except cheaper and less awkward. Dreams as excuses. Of course, dreams were also excuses. If you wanted to justify a decision, you could always lean on a dream. Why did you marry off your daughter to that ridiculous nobleman? Well, I dreamed it was the will of the gods. Problem solved. Sometimes dreams were even political weapons. Whispering that a rival had dreamed badly could undermine their standing. Imagine medieval gossip. "Oh, you didn't hear? The Duke dreamed of black smoke last night. Terrible omen. Wouldn't want to follow him into battle." It was half superstition, half smear campaign. And through it all, the anxiety stayed the same. Teeth falling out, falling endlessly, being chased, dreams of public embarrassment. Ancient tablets and papyri show that 3,000 years ago, people were waking up saying, "Well, that was unpleasant," and reaching for some interpretation that promised meaning, because humans, whether in Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Rome, couldn't accept that the strange chaos of dreams might just be chaos. They needed structure, explanation, a pattern, even if it was invented, which, in its own way, is rather sweet. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine yourself in an ancient city. Maybe you're lying on a woven mat in Mesopotamia, a clay tablet of dream omens nearby. Or maybe you're in an Egyptian temple, hoping the gods visit you in your sleep. Perhaps you're in Rome, ready to declare tomorrow that Mars himself came to you with advice. even if really you just dreamed about tripping over a goat. That fire is low. The night is quiet, and the dream, when it comes, will mean whatever you decide it means. So rest easy. You're in very old company. Hey everyone. Tonight we're not talking about dynasties collapsing or armies marching, at least not directly. We're going to look at something smaller, fluffier, and occasionally much more disruptive. Yes, the pets of royalty. Because if there's one thing history proves, it's that monarchs and nobles were rarely satisfied with a simple cat or dog. No, they wanted animals that showed off wealth, power, or eccentricity, which in practice usually meant these pets became political mascots or political nightmares. Let's start in France. King Louis Xi, the rather anxious monarch of the late 15th century, had a little greyhound named Cher Amy. The dog was his constant companion, so much so that courtiers sometimes had to wait until after the king had fed and fussed over the dog before they could present urgent matters of state. Cher Amy was pampered to the point of absurdity, but when the dog died, Louis was devastated. He ordered an elaborate funeral, which naturally raised eyebrows. After all, ordinary soldiers barely got a proper burial, and here was the king shedding tears over a greyhound. One chronicler dryly remarked that the death of Cher Amy caused more visible sorrow in the king than the deaths of several of his closest advisors. Priorities. Henry III and his pack of lapdogs moving across the Channel to England. We find Henry III of the 13th century. Now, Henry wasn't famous for military brilliance or strong finances, but he did excel at one thing: collecting small dogs. He adored them. Spaniels, terriers, tiny hounds. He had a palace positively echoing with barking. The trouble, of course, was that feeding a pack of lapdogs cost money, and since royal finances were always strained, people noticed. When you're taxing citizens heavily, and they see that money going toward meals for dogs eating better than they are, resentment tends to build. Chroniclers muttered that Henry seemed to prefer the company of his pets to his nobles, which, to be fair, might have been an understandable choice. Catherine the Great's greyhounds in Russia. Catherine the Great had an equally famous weakness for greyhounds. Her palace was full of them, and they were treated almost like courtiers themselves. They lounged in silk-lined baskets, wore jeweled collars, and attended her travels. One British ambassador politely noted that trying to have a private conversation with the Empress was difficult when two restless dogs were vying for her attention. It's tempting to imagine high-level diplomacy being delayed because a royal hound decided to chase its own tail across the throne room. But then, Catherine was Catherine. If anyone complained, they probably didn't for long. Spain's monkeys and parrots. Spain, meanwhile, took a more exotic route. The Habsburg monarchs loved monkeys and parrots. Both animals were symbols of global exploration, showing that the empire could bring back strange creatures from across the oceans. Charles V had entire aviaries. His son Philip too continued the tradition. The parrots were amusing until they started imitating courtiers' voices, often unflatteringly. Monkeys, on the other hand, had a habit of biting ambassadors, stealing food from banquets, and generally lowering the dignity of the Spanish crown, which is probably why later kings quietly phased them out in favor of less chaotic pets. William the Silent's loyal dog. Not every royal pet was just comic relief. Sometimes they made a real difference. William the Silent, leader of the Dutch revolt against Spain, had a small dog who once saved his life. The story goes that assassins crept into William's tent at night, and the little dog barked furiously, waking him just in time to escape. After that, William treated the dog as a trusted guardian. Of course, one loyal dog couldn't stop the dozens of later assassination attempts. But still, for one night, a pet made the difference between survival and disaster. Marie Antoinette's dogs at the guillotine, and then there's Marie Antoinette. Even as the French Revolution closed in, she held on to her beloved lapdogs. When she was imprisoned, her little pug followed her. Witnesses recalled the dog waiting faithfully, whining outside her cell. After her execution, the dog refused to leave the spot where he had last seen her. It's a sad note, but also a reminder of how human these relationships were. To everyone else, she was the Queen of France, symbol of excess. To one small dog, she was simply the person who provided affection and scraps. When pets become politics, so why did royal pets matter so much? Because in courts full of plotting nobles and whispering advisors, animals were uncomplicated. They didn't betray secrets, unless parrots accidentally repeated them. They didn't shift loyalties, unless monkeys were offered food by a rival. For rulers surrounded by constant politics, the loyalty of a dog or the silly chatter of a bird must have been oddly soothing. And yet, because these were royals, the animals inevitably did become political. A funeral for a greyhound became a scandal. A pack of lapdogs became a sign of wasted money. A parrot mocking an ambassador could sour a treaty. In the end, even pets weren't safe from the burdens of monarchy. So as you drift off tonight, imagine the royal courts of old not as silent marble halls, but as places filled with barking, shattering, scratching, and the occasional monkey making off with a silver spoon. Kings and queens may have commanded armies, but they were also forever at the mercy of their four-legged companions. And sometimes, those companions caused more trouble than all the generals put together. Hey everyone, tonight we're keeping the candles dim, the blankets warm, and wandering into a world that medieval people found both ordinary and terrifying. The nighttime, because for us, night is quiet, maybe peaceful, but for them, it was full of uncertainty. A place where disease worsened, shadows played tricks, and things with wings or claws were assumed to carry messages from the other side. So let's drift gently into the strange ways people of the Middle Ages thought about the dark hours. The two sleeps first. A small detail. People in the Middle Ages didn't always sleep the way we do. Instead of one long stretch, it was often two sleeps. You'd go to bed soon after sunset, sleep a few hours, then wake up in the middle of the night. You might say prayers, stoke the fire, or even visit neighbors. Then you'd return to bed until dawn. This watch in the middle of the night was considered normal, but it was also when people thought the world was most vulnerable to strange influences, which, of course, gave superstition plenty of room to stretch its legs. Moonlight worries. Let's start with the moon. Lovely, calming for us. But medieval people often treated moonlight as suspicious. They thought it could damage crops, sour milk, or even affect mental health. Moonstruck was not just a phrase. People truly believed prolonged exposure to moonlight could make you a little unhinged. Farmers sometimes covered their wells at night so the moon wouldn't spoil the water. And if you were a child, your parents might hurry you indoors, so the moonlight wouldn't cause a fever or fits. A silver glow across the village may have looked romantic, but it was met with a wary side eye. Owls, bats, and things that flap night birds carried a heavy burden in folklore. Owls, for example, were not wise. They were omens. An owl perched on a rooftop might mean illness was coming to the house. Their call in the dark could signal death. Bats weren't much luckier. They were associated with witchcraft, often thought to be witches' companions or creatures that could slip between worlds. A bat flying into a church was, unsurprisingly, taken as a very bad sign. It didn't help that both owls and bats were genuinely unsettling at night. Sudden, silent, and with eyes or wings that seemed unnatural in the flickering torchlight. Dreams as warnings. We touched on dreams before. But for medieval people, nighttime dreams were not simply strange stories from the brain. They were messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, sometimes from your digestion. A dream of water could mean fortune or drowning. A dream of a falling tree could signal the death of a relative. Entire manuals were written to decode these visions. And naturally, the middle of the night was when you'd wake up sweating, certain that a dream was a prophecy you couldn't escape. Midnight was the witching hour, of course. The dead of night was also thought to be the prime time for witches. Not the friendly storybook kind. Medieval witches were blamed for everything from spoiled butter to sudden storms. And people believed that at night, when respectable villagers slept, witches crept out to hold their gatherings. Roosters crowing at odd hours were sometimes interpreted as warnings that witches were about. So if you were awake during your first sleep break and you heard the rooster, you might pray just a little harder before blowing out your candle. Nightmares, in the literal sense, the word nightmare actually comes from a creature, the mare. This wasn't a horse, though. The mare was a spirit believed to sit on your chest at night, suffocating you and causing bad dreams. People who woke from sleep paralysis, unable to move, naturally assumed they were being pinned down by some malevolent thing. And so the legend of the nightmare spread. The cure? Prayers, charms under the pillow, or, in some households, simply sleeping on your side. Easier to roll a spirit off that way. Fires, charms, and protection because the night was risky. People took precautions. Fires were banked carefully, not just against the cold, but against whatever might creep in from outside. Candles were sometimes blessed before being left to burn. Charms were tucked under pillows, often herbs like St. John's wort or sprigs of rosemary. Iron objects, especially knives, were placed near beds to ward off spirits. Of course, nothing says restful sleep quite like the knowledge that you're clutching a kitchen knife against unseen demons. But it gave people comfort. Bells in the dark, church bells, were another layer of defense. It wasn't unusual for midnight bells to be rung in towns, especially during storms or epidemics, because sound itself was believed to drive away evil. The steady toll of a bell through a foggy night may have been eerie, but to a medieval village, it was also reassuring. Someone was keeping the dark at bay. The dawn as relief, and then, of course, came dawn. The first light of morning was not just practical, it was spiritual relief. Darkness meant danger, both natural and supernatural. Sunrise meant safety. Roosters crowing in daylight were no longer omens of witches, but signs that the world was returning to order. It's no wonder medieval people prayed more fervently at night, and no wonder they welcomed sunrise as a little resurrection, proof that the world had not been swallowed by the things lurking in shadow. So, as you let your own eyelids grow heavy, remember, medieval villagers listened for owls, covered their wells from moonlight, and tucked herbs under their pillows. They believed the night was crowded with forces we've long since dismissed, and yet their little rituals, the candle, the charm, the bell, were all, in a way, like ours. Small comforts to help us feel safe when the dark feels just a little too large. In our last journey, we explored how medieval people feared the night, witches in the fields, owls on rooftops, the strange grip of nightmares, and the constant sense that shadows carried secrets. But fear was only one part of the story. The hours between dusk and dawn were also filled with work, danger, prayers, pleasures, and mysteries that shaped medieval life in ways daylight never could. Tonight, we step further into those long hours of uncertainty and watch how people actually lived through the night. When the sun dipped below the horizon, most peasants ended their labor in the fields. But the dark didn't silence every trade. In towns, bakers rose from their beds long before dawn, stoking ovens while the streets outside lay silent. By sunrise, loaves would be ready for the hungry market. Blacksmiths, too, were known to hammer away into the night, their sparks glowing in the shadows like tiny stars. Monks treated the night as holy, waking for midnight prayers called matins. In monasteries, silence was broken only by chanting voices echoing against cold stone walls. For the devout, the night was not an enemy, but a sacred time of watching while the rest of the world slept. But in the streets outside, the dark was more dangerous. With no lamps to light the way, nighttime became the perfect cloak for crime. Cities often enforced curfews, and bells would ring to remind honest folk to stay indoors. Those caught wandering after hours without a lantern could quickly be suspected of mischief. Thieves and smugglers took advantage of this, moving quietly through alleys. Court records tell of masked bands who prowled under moonlight, raiding homes or ambushing travelers. For those who ventured out alone, the night was a gamble. You might reach your destination safely, or vanish into the silence without a trace. Night also carried a reputation for illness. Physicians believed fevers rose after sunset, and the rhythm of sickness was tied to the phases of the moon. A simple cough at midnight could be interpreted as something more sinister, a sign of enchantment or curse. Remedies were often timed carefully, with prayers whispered at certain hours, or herbs brewed beneath a particular moon. Not all of this was medical superstition, though. The cold air, damp floors, and smoky fires truly did make nighttime harder on the sick. But to medieval eyes, the worsening of illness after dark felt like proof that the night itself conspired against the body. Yet the dark wasn't only fear and frailty. For those who sought company, taverns and inns kept their doors open late. By flickering torchlight, people drank ale, sang songs, and shared stories that made the shadows outside feel a little less oppressive. Music and dice games echoed against wooden beams, while travelers swapped tales of roads they'd seen and dangers they'd faced. In noble houses, evenings were filled with feasts, laughter, and performances by musicians or jesters. The medieval night could be festive too. a chance for warmth and storytelling, not only for silence and dread. And still, beneath the merriment, the night held secrets. Lovers often met after sundown, slipping through gardens or across moonlit courtyards. Some monasteries even recorded confessions of people sneaking from their beds for secret encounters. Darkness provided cover not just for criminals, but for human longing, desire, and rebellion against the rigid rules of daylight life. Behind closed shutters, medieval people laughed, whispered, quarreled, and dreamed, just as we do now. Of course, the night also carried symbols of power. Fire, for example, was not just warmth, but protection. In towns, every hearth was carefully banked, and watchmen patrolled for signs of smoke or sparks. A stray ember could devour an entire street, and so the fire at night was both comfort and constant risk. Churches, too, used firelight. Candles lit at midnight services were believed to push back evil itself. The glow of a single flame was thought to drive spirits from a room, which is why many families kept at least one candle burning until dawn. Even sound became a form of protection. Midnight bells were often rung during storms or plagues. Their steady toll cut through the fog and darkness, reminding villagers that the church was watching over them, that the holy sound itself could scatter whatever prowled in the night. And for people huddled inside, listening in silence, those bells were both eerie and reassuring, the strange music of survival in a dangerous world. But perhaps the greatest secret of the medieval night was how it reshaped time itself. The two sleeps we explored earlier meant that midnight wasn't simply empty hours. It was a living part of the day, a time to pray, to talk, to think, to slip out for work or play. It was the moment when the boundaries blurred between safety and danger, between health and sickness, between ordinary life and superstition. Night created its own world, one that existed alongside the day, but was governed by different rules. And then, as always, came dawn. For peasants, the first light meant fields to till and animals to feed. For bakers, it meant fresh bread ready on the table. For monks, it was the quiet satisfaction of prayers completed. And for everyone else, it was relief. The return of light was more than just practical. It was symbolic. Darkness meant the unknown, and daylight meant order restored. In that moment, the fears of the night shrank away, leaving only the routines of another day. Oh, the medieval night was never simple. It was both enemy and ally, filled with dangers and joys, prayers and crimes, silence and song. It tested survival and revealed the fragile line between faith and fear. And perhaps that's why it still fascinates us, because in their candles, bells, songs, and charms, we glimpse a reflection of our own small rituals, the little things we cling to when the world outside feels too large, too quiet, and too dark.